I have seen people walk into my courtroom like they own it, confident, untouchable, protected by their wealth and their status. They believe their name alone will act as a shield, and that their power will carry them out the exact same doors they walked in through. But there was one afternoon when a woman named Karen Sterling sat across from a young, struggling freelance designer, smirked at me from behind her expensive designer handbag, and attempted to dictate exactly how I should run my courtroom. She thought her aggressive posture made her look powerful. What Karen did not realize was that the thick, meticulously organized file she had proudly slammed onto the defense table contained the exact document that would not only cost her $35,000, but expose a devastating truth she had spent months trying to hide. Before we go any further, make sure you have subscribed to this channel for more powerful courtroom stories like this one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Also, comment below and tell us where you are watching this video from. Now, let me take you back to where this case truly began. The plaintiff was a woman named Emily Hayes, 28 years old, an independent interior designer trying to build her small business. She walked into my courtroom clutching a thin manila folder tightly against her chest, her knuckles white, the way people hold documents when those papers represent their entire livelihood. Across from her sat Karen Sterling, 52 years old, wearing a tailored suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Karen placed a massive, overflowing leather binder onto the table with a loud thud, as if the sheer weight of her paperwork was a legal argument in itself. Karen looked relaxed. Too relaxed. Years on the bench teach you that calm can mean two very different things. Sometimes, calm comes from having the truth on your side. Other times, calm comes from absolute entitlement. Karen had the second kind. The dispute involved a luxury home renovation. Emily claimed Karen hired her company to redesign the entire first floor of her sprawling summer estate. The contract was signed, the custom materials were ordered, and Emily worked grueling 14-hour days for 4 months straight to meet an aggressive deadline. But on the exact day the final $35,000 payment was due, Karen abruptly locked Emily out of the property, refusing to pay a single dime. I looked at the plaintiff. "Miss Hayes, please state your claim and explain what happened." Emily stood up carefully, her voice shaking but determined. "Your Honor, the contract was clear. I completed the design, managed the contractors, and sourced all the materials. Every week, Miss Sterling approved the progress. But 2 days before completion, before the young woman could even finish her sentence, Karen rolled her eyes and interrupted loudly. 'Your Honor, please. We can wrap this up in 5 minutes if you just look at my file.' Her work was absolute garbage, and I had to fire her." The courtroom fell silent. I stared down at the defense table. "Miss Sterling, in this room, you do not interrupt. You speak when I tell you to speak." Karen tilted her head, let out a dramatic, performative sigh, and smiled. Not an apologetic smile, a smile of pure contempt. That small gesture told me a great deal. Respectful people may disagree, but entitled people perform their disagreement. She was challenging me, daring me to question her authority. What she didn't know was that I was already looking closely at the massive binder she brought to destroy Emily, and I was about to open it. I looked down at the stack of emails Karen had so confidently submitted into evidence. Page after page of highlighted complaints, bold text, and aggressive demands. At first glance, it looked like the paper trail of a deeply dissatisfied client. But years on the bench teach you that a mountain of paper is often used to hide a molehill of truth. I organized the printed emails by date. Interesting. Very interesting. The renovation project began on March 1st. I looked at the correspondence for March. Nothing but pleasantries. "The paint color looks fabulous, Emily," read one email dated March 15th. I moved to April. "The custom cabinets are exactly what I envisioned." Another glowing review. May came and went. Still no complaints. "In fact, on May 20th, Karen wrote, 'I can't wait to host my summer gala here. You're doing a miraculous job.'" Then came June. Specifically, June 12th, exactly 2 days after Emily submitted the final invoice for the remaining $35,000, which included the reimbursement for the luxury lighting fixtures Emily had purchased on her own personal credit card. Suddenly, on June 13th, the tone changed completely. The emails became hostile. The paint was peeling, the cabinets were misaligned, the lighting was cheap. I looked up from the file. Karen was still smiling, looking around the courtroom as if waiting for my approval. "Miss Sterling," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet room, "I am looking at your evidence." "I know, Your Honor. It speaks for itself, doesn't it?" It certainly does, I replied, but perhaps not in the way you intended. The smile on Karen's face twitched, just for a fraction of a second. According to your own records, you were absolutely thrilled with Miss Hayes's work for 3.5 months. You praised her design. You even told her she was doing a miraculous job. Is that correct? Karen crossed her arms, suddenly looking defensive. I was being polite. I didn't want to hurt her feelings. You were being polite, I repeated flatly. For 3.5 months, while she installed tens of thousands of dollars worth of materials in your home, you said nothing because you were being polite? I'm a generous person, Your Honor. Interesting answer. Not a believable answer, but an interesting one. So your generosity ended exactly 48 hours after she handed you the final bill? I asked. The courtroom became completely silent. The spectators stopped moving. Even the court officer leaned in slightly, because suddenly, this wasn't a case about substandard work anymore. It was a case about intent. Karen scoffed, though her voice lacked its earlier volume. That's just a coincidence. That's when I finally noticed all the terrible flaws. Miss Sterling, I don't believe in coincidences. I believe in timelines. Your timeline tells me you waited until she maxed out her personal credit cards to buy your luxury fixtures, let her install them, and then manufactured a dispute to keep the materials for free. Karen slammed her hand on the table. That is an outrageous accusation. I am a wealthy woman. If you would just read the contractor's estimate I provided, you'll see exactly how much it cost me to fix her mess. Oh, I intend to read it, I said. I turned to the next section of her binder. She had included a formal estimate from another contracting firm detailing $40,000 worth of repairs. But as I read the name at the top of that estimate, the entire case shifted. I read it once, then twice. I slowly looked up at Karen. The arrogance had entirely vanished from her face, replaced by a very sudden, very real flash of panic. Karen Sterling's face betrayed everything her expensive blazer was trying to hide. The absolute silence in the courtroom wasn't just shock, it was the realization of something far darker than a simple breach of contract. Years on the bench teach you to distinguish between a bad client and a malicious one. A bad client disputes a bill out of dissatisfaction or stubbornness. A malicious client disputes a bill because they never intended to pay it in the first place. I stared at the fraudulent document, then back at Karen. Miss Sterling, do you understand what it means to present a fabricated document in a court of law? Her voice, usually loud and commanding, dropped to a frantic whisper. It isn't fabricated. Richard really is a contractor. He really did look at the work. On June 5th? I asked, my voice cutting through her panic. While Miss Hayes was still legally employed by you, actively installing lighting fixtures she purchased with her personal credit cards, you and your husband sat down, assessed catastrophic damage that hadn't even happened yet, and drafted a fake $40,000 estimate to use as a weapon against her? Emily Hayes was staring at Karen, her hands trembling. You plan to fire me? She whispered, her voice raw. You let me max out my credit cards, knowing you were going to lock me out? Karen didn't look at Emily. She couldn't. She kept her eyes glued to me, searching for a way out. Entitled people often struggle when confronted with irrefutable proof of their own bad behavior. They are so accustomed to talking their way out of consequences that they freeze when facts finally corner them. Your Honor, Karen stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the paperwork. That date must be a typo. Richard must have typed the wrong date. It was a clerical error. A typo, I repeated flatly. A typo that perfectly aligns with a conspiracy to commit fraud. Yes, a typo, Karen insisted, her voice rising in desperation. Interesting, I said. Very interesting. Because if it was a typo, I'm sure the email metadata will clear everything up. I turned the page in Karen's massive binder. She had been so incredibly thorough in her attempt to bury Emily that she had included printed copies of everything, including the email exchange where her husband had sent her the estimate. Let's see, I read aloud, holding up the printed email. From Richard Sterling to Karen Sterling. Date, June 5th, 2:14 p.m. Subject, the estimate. And what does the body of the email say? Ah, here it is. I paused, letting the silence build. Karen looked like she might be physically ill. The email reads, Here is the $40,000 estimate we discussed. Keep letting her work until she finishes the master bathroom lighting. Wait until she submits the final invoice before you lock the gates. That way she'll be too broke to hire a lawyer to fight us. See you at dinner. Love, Richard. The courtroom erupted. Spectators gasped, whispering furiously to one another. The bailiff had to call for order. Emily Hayes put her hands over her face, tears finally spilling over as the full weight of the deception hit her. I looked at Karen. She was completely motionless. The illusion of control, the arrogance, the designer suit, none of it mattered anymore. She had walked into my courtroom expecting to humiliate a young, struggling designer. Instead, she had handed me the exact evidence required to prove she and her husband were engaged in premeditated theft. "A typo, Miss Sterling?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, though it echoed in the quiet room. "Or a documented, premeditated scheme to steal $35,000 in labor and materials from a young woman trying to build her business?" Karen had nothing to say. She looked down at the table, her hands gripping the edges so tightly her knuckles were white. The power dynamic had completely collapsed. The woman who had smirked at me, interrupted the plaintiff, and demanded I rush my docket was now utterly defenseless, trapped by the very paperwork she thought made her invincible. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. It was the kind of silence that happens when everyone simultaneously realizes they are witnessing a catastrophe. Karen Sterling's tailored suit suddenly looked like a costume that no longer fit. Her mouth opened and closed, searching for words, but her usual arrogance had been completely hollowed out by the contents of her own meticulously organized binder. Years on the bench teach you that people who construct elaborate lies often forget one crucial detail. The truth does not need to be invented, it merely needs to be revealed. Karen had spent months building a paper fortress to crush a struggling designer. She had anticipated every argument, coordinated a fraudulent estimate with her husband, and brought a binder full of evidence to overwhelm me. But in her absolute certainty that she was the smartest person in the room, she had handed me the blueprint to her own destruction. I looked at Emily Hayes. The young woman was gripping the edge of the table, tears streaming down her face. But they were no longer tears of anxiety. They were tears of profound realization. She had spent weeks agonizing over what she had done wrong, questioning her talent and her business. Now, she knew the truth. She had done nothing wrong. She had walked into a trap set by people who believed their wealth made them untouchable. "Miss Hayes," I said, my voice softening, "you have nothing to be ashamed of here today. Your work was not substandard. You were targeted by a predator." I turned my gaze back to the defense table, my voice hardening into steel. "Miss Sterling, you did not just breach a contract, you committed premeditated fraud. You orchestrated a scheme to extort this young woman's labor, steal her materials, and weaponize the legal system to cover your tracks." Karen shook her head frantically, her composure shattering completely. "Your Honor, you misunderstand. We were just protecting our assets. She was overcharging us." "Protecting your assets?" I repeated, my tone laced with disgust. "You let her max out her personal credit cards to buy your luxury fixtures, knowing you were going to lock the gates. You did not protect your assets. You stole hers. You thought you could mock the process, but your own files betrayed you." Karen looked wildly around the room, as if expecting someone to intervene. But there was no one. Her husband wasn't there. Her wealth couldn't speak for her. "I am entering judgment for the plaintiff in the amount of $35,000, I announced, my voice carrying the full weight of the court. "Furthermore, I am imposing the maximum allowable punitive damages for fraud and bad faith in this jurisdiction. Total judgment, $50,000. Karen gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. $50,000? You can't do that." "I just did," I replied coldly, "and consider yourself incredibly fortunate that I am only dealing with the civil aspects of this dispute. The deliberate fabrication of a financial document to defraud a contractor is a matter I will be referring to the district attorney's office for review." The color completely drained from Karen's face. The $50,000 was suddenly the least of her problems. She had walked in believing she could dictate the law. She was walking out facing potential criminal charges. "Court is adjourned," I said, striking the gavel. As the courtroom cleared, I remained seated for a moment, watching Karen gather her massive leather binder. It seemed much heavier now. She had thought her wealth and her arrogance made her invincible, but in the end, it was her own hubris that brought her down. Experience teaches you many things. It teaches you to look for the timeline, to read the hesitation, to recognize the performance of entitlement. But most importantly, it teaches you that arrogance is almost always the architect of its own collapse. Karen Sterling thought she was manipulating a novice designer and a tired judge. She didn't realize she was writing her own confession. If Karen Sterling had simply breached her contract, if she had genuinely been unhappy with the work and stubbornly refused to pay, She might have faced a civil judgment and a stern lecture, but the document she submitted changed the very nature of the hearing. It was no longer about interior design. It was about the anatomy of a scam. You intended to rob her from the very beginning, I repeated, the words settling heavily over the courtroom. Karen's hands were shaking so violently she had to interlock her fingers and press them flat against the table. No, Your Honor, please. Richard wrote the date wrong. It's a typo. Stop talking, Miss Sterling, I commanded. Every word you say is digging a deeper hole. You presented a fraudulent document to this court under penalty of perjury. You conspired with your husband to create a false financial liability to intimidate a young woman into forfeiting $35,000 of her own money and labor. I looked over at Emily Hayes. She wasn't just crying anymore, she was shaking with relief. The months of gaslighting, the aggressive emails, the threats to ruin her reputation, it all made sense now. She hadn't failed as a designer. She had simply succeeded in being exactly the kind of victim Karen and Richard Sterling thought they could exploit. Miss Hayes, I said gently, did you ever meet Richard Sterling during the 4 months you worked on this property? Emily wiped her eyes and shook her head. No, Your Honor. Miss Sterling said her husband was too busy with his firm to be involved in the design process. I only ever dealt with her. I see, I said, turning my focus back to Karen. He was too busy to meet the designer, but not too busy to draft a fraudulent $40,000 repair estimate for work that hadn't even been finished yet. Karen looked down. The absolute silence in the room was deafening. Entitled people build their lives around the assumption that their wealth and status will protect them from accountability. They believe that if they yell loudly enough, or hire expensive enough lawyers, or present a thick enough binder of documents, reality will bend to their will. But a courtroom is one of the few places on earth where privilege cannot rewrite the facts. And the facts in Karen's own binder were catastrophic. Miss Sterling, I said, my voice sharp and final. You walked into this courtroom today and smirked at me. You rolled your eyes at the plaintiff. You told me my time was valuable and demanded I rush my docket. You thought you could use this court as a weapon to legitimize your theft. I picked up the fraudulent estimate and dropped it back onto her massive pile of evidence. The sound echoed in the quiet room. You are not a victim. You are a predator, I stated flatly. And you have made a very, very expensive mistake. Karen opened her mouth to protest, but the look in my eyes stopped her cold. She finally realized what I had known since she first walked in. She had completely lost control. The narrative she had so carefully constructed had been dismantled by her own arrogance. I am entering judgment for the plaintiff, Emily Hayes, for the full amount of $35,000, I announced. Furthermore, due to the egregious nature of the fraud attempted in this courtroom today, I am awarding the maximum allowable punitive damages, total judgment, $50,000. Karen let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. $50,000? Your Honor, you can't do that. I just did, I replied coldly. And frankly, Miss Sterling, the money is the least of your concerns. I am impounding this binder as evidence. The deliberate fabrication of a financial document to defraud a contractor is not a civil dispute. It is a crime. I will be forwarding this entire file, including your husband's estimate and your email correspondence, directly to the district attorney's office. The color drained entirely from Karen's face. She looked as though she might faint. She had walked in believing she was untouchable. She was walking out facing potential criminal conspiracy charges. Court is adjourned, I said, striking the gavel with finality. I watched as Karen Sterling stood up slowly, leaving her precious leather binder on the defense table. She didn't look at Emily. She didn't look at the spectators. She walked out of the courtroom looking small, defeated, and entirely ordinary. Her power had failed. Her character had decided everything. As the sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted entirely. It is a fascinating phenomenon to witness the exact moment when the air leaves a bully's lungs. For the entire morning, Karen Sterling had consumed all the oxygen in the room, suffocating the plaintiff with her aggressive posture and performative size. Now, she was the one suffocating in the vacuum of her own consequences. She reached out, her hands trembling uncontrollably, attempting to grab the massive leather binder she had so proudly slammed onto the table just an hour earlier. But before her manicured fingers could even brush the leather, my court officer stepped forward, placing a firm hand heavily over the documents. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the officer said, his voice polite but unyielding. "The judge ordered this file impounded. It belongs to the court now." Karen recoiled as if she had been burned. She looked up at the bench, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate pleading. The smirk was completely gone. The condescension had evaporated. She was no longer a wealthy socialite dictating the terms of her reality. She was a suspect in a criminal fraud investigation, stripped of the very paperwork she thought would protect her. Years on the bench teach you that true character is revealed, not when a person is winning, but when they realize they have definitively lost. Some people apologize. Some people reflect. Karen Sterling simply looked around for someone else to blame. She muttered something incoherent under her breath, grabbed her designer handbag, and practically fled the courtroom, her expensive heels clicking frantically against the hardwood floor. She didn't look back. She couldn't. I turned my attention to Emily Hayes. The young designer was still seated at the plaintiff's table, carefully packing her single, thin manila folder into her tote bag. Her hands were still shaking, but her posture had fundamentally changed. She wasn't shrinking into herself anymore. She stood up, looked toward the bench, and gave a small, deeply respectful nod. She didn't need to speak. Relief has a very specific look. It is the physical unburdening of a weight a person was never meant to carry. Emily had walked into my courtroom believing she was entirely at the mercy of a woman who had the money and power to destroy her career. She walked out knowing that the truth, when properly illuminated, is heavier than any bank account. I watched her leave the room, feeling a familiar sense of quiet satisfaction. But the case of Karen Sterling was far from over. The $50,000 judgment was merely the civil conclusion. The true cost of Karen's arrogance and the fraudulent estimate she and her husband had engineered was about to unfold outside the walls of my courtroom in a much darker, much more serious legal arena. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung shut behind Karen Sterling, but the silence she left in her wake was deafening. It wasn't just the silence of a concluded case. It was the quiet aftermath of a carefully constructed reality crashing down. The air felt lighter, as if a great pressure had finally been lifted from the room. I sat back in my chair, looking at the massive, abandoned leather binder, still sitting on the defense table. It was a monument to hubris. Karen had spent months building that file, curating emails, highlighting minor complaints, and conspiring with her husband to forge a document that would ruin a young woman's livelihood. She believed that volume equaled validity. She thought that if she just provided enough paper, she could bury the truth underneath it. But years on the bench teach you that the truth is incredibly resilient. It doesn't need to be loud, and it doesn't need to be wrapped in expensive leather. It simply needs to be seen. Emily Hayes was still at the plaintiff's table, her hands resting flat against the cool wood. She wasn't shaking anymore. She looked exhausted, yes, but the profound anxiety that had contorted her face when she first walked in was gone. She had been gaslit for months, told by a wealthy, powerful woman that her work was garbage, her skills were amateurish, and her career was essentially over. "Miss Hayes," I said, breaking the silence. Emily looked up, her eyes still red but clear. "Yes, Your Honor? I want you to understand something very important," I told her, making sure my voice carried the full weight of my experience. "When people like Miss Sterling attack your character or your competence, it is rarely about you. It is almost always about them. They use intimidation to hide their own deceit. Do not let this experience make you question your talent. Let it make you smarter about who you do business with." Emily nodded slowly, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through. "Thank you, Your Honor. Truly. I thought I was going crazy." "You weren't crazy," I assured her. "You were just dealing with a predator. And today, the predator got caught." I instructed the bailiff to securely log the defense binder into evidence. The civil matter of the unpaid $35,000 and the $15,000 in punitive damages was settled. But the legal nightmare for Karen and Richard Sterling was only just beginning. When a judge forwards a case to the district attorney for potential criminal fraud, it doesn't just disappear into a filing cabinet. It triggers an investigation. It means subpoenas for business records, audits of Vanguard Premier Contracting, and very uncomfortable questions about how many other typographical errors might exist in Richard Sterling's past estimates. Karen had walked into my courtroom believing she was untouchable because she had money. She failed to realize that while money can buy you a lot of things, designer suits, luxury renovations, and expensive binders, it cannot buy immunity from the facts. She thought she was manipulating a struggling young woman and an impatient judge. Instead, she had meticulously documented her own conspiracy to commit fraud, signed it, dated it, and handed it directly to the bench. The $50,000 judgment was painful, certainly, but the true cost of Karen Sterling's arrogance was the complete, public destruction of her credibility and the looming shadow of a criminal indictment. Experience teaches you that power without character is always fragile, and eventually, the weight of the truth will always break it. After the heavy oak doors closed and the courtroom finally emptied, the lingering energy of the case remained. The legal system is often criticized for favoring the wealthy, the connected, and the powerful. People assume that money automatically buys immunity, but on days like that one, the system works exactly as it was inherently designed to. A courtroom is the ultimate equalizer. It does not care about the designer label on your tailored blazer, the exclusive zip code of your summer estate, or the sheer, demanding volume of your voice. It only cares about the facts. I later learned that the district attorney's office did, in fact, take the fraudulent estimate very seriously. Vanguard Premier Contracting faced a rigorous, invasive state audit. Richard and Karen Sterling were forced to answer for a documented pattern of deceptive business practices. The $50,000 civil judgment I handed down was merely the opening act of a much longer, much more devastating legal reckoning. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars defending themselves against criminal fraud charges, watching their pristine reputation within their elite social circles completely disintegrate. Emily Hayes, on the other hand, used the $50,000 judgment to properly expand her independent design firm. She learned a difficult, painful lesson about contracts, boundaries, and the harsh reality of dealing with predatory clients. But more importantly, she learned that she did not have to shrink herself just because someone with a larger bank account told her she was worthless. Cases like Karen Sterling stay with me, not because of the dramatic twist or the shocking documents, but because of the fundamental lesson they reveal about human nature. People who consistently abuse power often mistake cruelty for strength. They believe that if they can make someone else feel small, it makes their own arguments look towering. They construct elaborate illusions of superiority, assuming the rest of the world will simply bow down and accept it. But true strength does not require a fabricated paper trail. True strength does not need to shout or perform. It is found in the quiet, undeniable weight of character. Karen walked into my courtroom believing her name and her wealth were an impenetrable shield. She thought she was entirely untouchable. She laughed at the process. What she learned the hard way is that when power is built on a foundation of absolute lies, it only takes one single piece of paper to bring the entire fortress crashing down to the floor. Next time you see someone abusing their privilege or hiding behind their status to crush someone they deem inferior, remember this case. Remember Karen Sterling, because eventually, no matter how much money is involved, the truth always speaks for itself.